Need to create a complex enterprise Angular application? Angular Bootcamp is an intensive 3-day workshop class to learn the basics of Angular through sophisticated techniques for real-world applications. We target Angular 6 and the recent versions, with much of the curriculum is suitable back to Angular 2. Or go beyond the 3-day class with a consultation or project launch with Oasis Digital, the team behind Angular Bootcamp. We can assist your team or launch your project with advanced Angular topics including scalability, data flow, state management, full stack product design, and more. Contact us for a private class at your location or buy a ticket for public classes in various cities around the US and occasionally in Europe. Online live instructor training is also available at angularbootcamp.com. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Angular. I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week our guest is Adrian. How do you say your last name, Adrian?
It's Fâciu.
Fâciu.
Yes, something like that. Hi all.
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Let people know who you are.
Yeah, sure. I'm Adrian. I'm a developer from Romania, and I've been involved with Angular development since I think it was in beta version or something like that. And I work for Visma, which is a Norwegian company.
Very cool. So you live in Romania and work for a Norwegian company?
Yes, they have an office here, but
nice.
Mainly their customers are in the Nordics,
and
I get to travel there several times per year.
Yeah, I find it interesting how global the market has become. I've talked to people that work for American companies in a number of different countries, and companies from other countries in Europe, different from the ones that they live in. And yeah, it's just interesting how it's become this more global phenomenon where people can kind of work from wherever they want for companies in completely different countries.
Yeah, I think it's great, and you can find awesome distributed teams, like one guy in each country, and everything works fine.
Yep, absolutely. So you said that they have an office down near where you live?
Yeah, we started from a few people, and now we're like over 200.
Oh, wow. Very cool. Just real briefly before we get into the topic here, how are you folks using Angular over there? Is it internal tools, or is it customer-facing tools, or all of the above, or how does that all work out?
Well, I think we have several products that use Angular, and they are all customer-facing products deployed in production and everything, and with customers using them. I'm not aware of any internal tools, so most of the applications that use Angular get to the customers.
Cool. Let me really quickly just dive into this blog post that you wrote on Angular in Depth. It's just tips and tricks for NgRx. And I'll admit that I'm not as familiar with NgRx as I would like to be. And our NgRx experts aren't here. So I'm going to dive in and I'm going to ask all my newbie questions, and then you can kind of go into more depth. But yeah, this article, you kind of break things up into actions, effects, reducers, and general tips. Now, do you want to just, before we get into this too far, do you want to just explain what all of those are for people who aren't as familiar with NgRx? What actions, effects, reducers are? Yeah,
sure. So the short story of that article is that after I've worked with NgRx for over 1 year, I've seen people doing different things, and I've learned some things the hard way, mainly doing them wrong myself and then figuring this out.
I think a lot of us do that on React.
Exactly.
On React Roundup this morning, one of our panelists said that you don't get it right until you've written it 3 times. So
yeah, something like that. And well, after I figure out some things, everyone says that if you want to write a blog post, make it about what you wanted to find out like half a year ago. So I tried to write something that I would have loved to read when I started with all of this, and get a better idea of what I was doing and how.
Very cool. Looks like John Poppett just joined us. John, do you want to say hi real quick? Anyway, he knows a bit more about NgRx than I do, so this will be good. Now we can ask all the expert questions alongside my noob questions. So so actions, effects, reducers. Yeah, you wrote about something that you wished was out there.
Yeah, so basically NgRx is a library that helps you manage state in an Angular application.
Yeah, so you talk about using classes for all actions. What difference does that make?
Yeah, well, these actions is how you modify the state. Basically, you emit an action with type and some maybe sort of payload, the data that the action has. And usually in React or other ecosystems, this is just an object. So you have an object with a type and that's it. That's an action.
Right.
You could do that in Angular also. But since we're relying on TypeScript, using just a plain old object won't be that great for us because we won't have any kind of type safety or code completion when we work with it. If we create classes for all our actions, we'll be able to benefit from this type of type safety or code completion. So, for example, when we're using the action, we know exactly that it has a payload with this type of object inside it. Or when we use it in a reducer, the reducer is the part that updates the state. We can tell the reducer that this is the type of actions that we expect to get in. And then we know everything about that action, basically how it's supposed to look. We know that it has a payload with, for example, a message property that's a string and so on. So we can easily work with the code and refactor it and so on. People complain that it's a bit more boilerplate to create classes for all these actions. But in the end, I think on the long run, it's a benefit for everyone.
That makes sense. So essentially what you're saying then is, let's say we set up a class for your example, you use a log error.
Yeah, we can have all kind of examples like a log or all of, for example, we have actions related to a user, and we'll create a class for user login and user logout and user change name and so on. And so we'll have if we have 10 actions related to users, we'll have 10 different classes that represent these actions.
Gotcha. And so when you hand it off to the reducer, then the reducer knows it's getting something consistent every time.
Yeah, basically it allows to write easier the code in the reducer and to refactor it more easily. And there are some other tricks that we can use related to these classes. Like, for example, keeping all of them in the same file. And this is contrary to what you'd call a best practice, because usually whenever you create a class, you'll have one file for each class. But if you have, like I said, 10 different classes for all the actions for a user, you'll just keep them in the same file. It makes way more sense to do that. TSLint will probably complain, but you can disable the rule for that specific file. And since you have all of them in the same file, you can do different things with them. Like in TypeScript, we have this type called the union type.
Mm-hmm.
And basically we can create a type, call it like user actions. And it's all the classes that we just defined. So it's a union type that's basically any of the user actions. And then in a reducer, we'll just specify, okay, we'll expect a user action, and user action is any of those classes. That's sort of a nice way to do it.
I'm a little curious. You said that you learned a lot of these by doing things wrong. So what does it look like if you don't do it right? What kinds of things are you going to run into?
Well, for example, if you don't put all your classes in the same file related to one type of entity, you'll end up with lots of files. And then that will be a bit of a nightmare to maintain. If you don't create this kind of union types, you'll have to copy-paste all the actions in different places. So you're going to say, here I would want an action that's user login or user logout or user change name, instead of just saying user actions. That's one example.
That makes sense.
And whenever we create these classes for the same way, like learning the hard way, I was usually naming them, including the entity, just to create intent, like user login, user fetch, and so on, like putting user in front of all of them. And then when I wanted to use one, I just put dot after something. It's like 20 actions that all start with user, and good luck finding the one you want. That was becoming a bit trickier. So I started to drop this entity name in the classes. Like I just call it login and logout and so on. And whenever I'm using them, I just import everything from that file and give it an alias. Like import everything from user actions as user actions, and then I have user actions fetch or user actions login and so on. And this
interesting.
makes it a bit easier to manage and avoid like really long names.
So if you import
user actions, like you said, does it import all of the other types, the login and everything else?
Yeah, you just import everything from that file.
Right.
And you give it an alias, and it's the way you work it afterwards.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I was just thinking that, John, if you have any thoughts or questions here, maybe you can chime in. I know some of these are probably pretty obvious to you, and some of them might be new to you. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm scanning through here, and let's just focus on actions because that's what you were just talking about for a moment. So the negative I hear a lot with actions, especially in Angular, is that because we're using TypeScript, we create constants, which quite frankly, a lot of people in Vue will create constants too for their actions, for their Vuex, which is like their version of NgRx. So you still have those, but the action class creators, they seem to me to cause an undue amount of stress on people, myself included, for just how much additional code that actually ends up making you have to write. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, this is what I tried to avoid in the beginning. Exactly like you said, I didn't want to write all that code.
Yeah.
And I spent a bit of time investigating different ways of handling this. But in the end, the fact that, I have these classes and I can rely on TypeScript for sort of like type safety and ease of refactoring and so on the long run, for me, it was a benefit, and I just got used to having all those classes.
I hear that a lot, and I feel you. When I was doing NgRx originally, I did the same thing. I wrote them. I didn't like them. I got rid of them. And then I missed the type safety and the tooling support that you got with them. So I went back to them. The other thing I didn't like is that, and it's not just that it was a class, it was that every time I created a new action, I had to create the constant. I had to create the, what do we call them, action class creators. And then at the very end of the file, and I always forgot to do this, the place where you do the union type at the end, I'd often forget to actually add that action to the end of it. I don't even know what you call that thing. It's just a group union type, right?
Yeah, and union type.
Yeah, and if you don't add all of those things, then your actions don't actually work, even though you can create them. I guess that's been the struggle for me with the actions. It's like, even on a simple project, I've had action files with 120 lines of code for a single model. And that's kind of a put off to me. It just seems like a lot of repetitive code. I guess it's more of a statement than a question. It sounds like it's just one of those things that you learn to get over with NgRx. Is that right?
For me, it was. I mean, I did the same thing as what you just said. I mean, sometimes I forget to add it to union types also, and then I'm just going back and trying to figure out what I did wrong. But I did it the other way. Basically, I tried to use it without classes.
Yeah.
And I had so many pains with this, then I just went back and said, okay, let's just create classes for everything. It's a lot of code, but maybe I just learned to ignore it. And I like the benefits more than the fact that there are too many classes.
Yeah, and kind of moving on to some of the tips that you have in the actions. I like your ideas here of, keeping it all in the file. So kind of separating your actions out with the naming conventions in the files. I think I'm looking here, like you're saying, use short name for the constants in the classes. I agree there. How do you feel about the names of those actions? Like, I noticed you're doing uppercase for the constants, and then inside of the actions, you're doing like documents fetch success, or documents is like just a regular spelled word where the first letter is capitalized and the rest. Do you have like conventions that you generally tell people they should be using there?
Generally, I just look to what people are using and I pick them up. I'm using them exactly like in the example, just trying to write where the action is or where it's coming from, and then the name of it.
Yeah.
But one thing that I've initially did wrong there, and then I figured it out, was that I was basically reusing actions. And Mike Ryan has a very good talk about good actions hygiene about this.
Yeah.
Basically, you can have one action, and if you use it like from 10 places from your application, then you have no idea where it's coming, and debugging begins to be quite a pain. So right now, whenever I create those constants, maybe I put something like documents dash, I don't know, documents page or documents dash document details for different actions. So beside the entity, I also know the place in the application where that action is generated.
The important part too of naming, not the name of the constant, but the name of the string inside of it, to me, is really the value that the Redux dev tools give you. When you roll that in Chrome and you want to see what's happening with your state, it really does help to have a consistent naming convention there so you can actually see what the actions are being displayed, because that's what's showing up inside that tool. So I think, the constants aside, that's for you to read the code. But I think the string name, it's important just to continue a naming convention. So when you're debugging, which eventually you will do, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's usually a pain point if you don't do it right. And then when you look in the dev tools, you have no idea what's happening there. And then,
you're like, what the heck is happening here? I don't even know.
Exactly.
No, I think, in actions, it's just one of those necessary things that we have to have in this pattern. To me, it's a love-hate relationship just because there's so much code that goes along with it. And inevitably, it becomes a thing that I copy and paste, which usually means I end up forgetting to change something.
Yeah.
So I hear you. I agree with you that it's valuable. I don't necessarily like creating them. It's one of the things that turned me off originally about NgRx, to be honest.
No, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out a different solution for this. Like several people were telling me, just create action classes for these actions and go on. I was like, no, I won't have that much code. And after a while, I just gave up. Okay, this is how it works, and let's just use it.
So I find it interesting too, moving on to effects. The idea of effects in NgRx is it's a way for you to do a side effect, right? So everything that happens inside the Redux cycle for state management, this pattern, is synchronous. And if you want to do something outside of that, that's when you pull in effects, right?
Yeah, basically for any kind of HTTP call or any kind of processing that's not synchronous, you need to do it in an effect.
Yeah, HTTP is a great example of that. And it could also even be like calling some other API, like some AiA API, for example, like we do Azure Cognitive Services a lot, my team, and we'll call off to one of those APIs asynchronously in an effect. But I've heard a lot of people say, you don't even really need effects to do NgRx, or maybe they won't even use effects. They'll get their data in other ways. How do you feel about this? Do you feel like using the effects themselves is good, or you should do it in some other way?
I've seen projects that don't use them at all. But from my point of view, they make my components way cleaner. For example, I don't want my component to know that I have some kind of HTTP service that will fetch the data and details of the implementation and how to fetch it. I just let my component to know that it has to emit some event and get some data, and that's it.
Because otherwise, let's think about getting a list of customers. If you use effects, you just say, give me the customers. It looks in your store to see if they're there or not. It'll call the effect as a side effect. It'll first give you back nothing, let's say, and that through an observable. The side effect will kick off asynchronously, go get the customers, populate the state, and then the cycle still gives you, I'm using my hands here, nobody can see me. Is that, forget that I'm on a podcast here. Side effect is that the effects will then load the customers into the state, and then you'll still get those to the component. So it kind of feels magical and it's fun, and I like it. But I agree with you. If you don't use effects and you still need to go get the customers, do you just in a component, do you say, hey, use Redux to give me the customers? If they're not there, first go off to, maybe some Angular service that I wrote, and asynchronously call the service and then come back. And then in the component, you've got them. So then you stuff it in state and ask the state for it again. That seems kind of weird to me, to not use the effects.
I think you have several benefits. The components become way easier to test if you don't have this kind of logic inside them. And for example, if you want to implement some kind of caching on your web app in the client, it's way easier if you just have the effects and just put everything in the state.
Let's be curious to hear. Chuck, did you say that you don't use the Redux pattern much?
I haven't had as much chance to dive into it as I would like. I'm starting to get into Vue and Vuex, which is built on the Redux pattern. But,
same kind of pattern, yeah.
But I haven't done much with it yet.
Well, I'm curious because we've both used this in NgRx, and it sounds like you have not. I'm curious from somebody who hasn't dove into the specific NgRx. Does the idea of effects make sense to you, or?
Yeah, I've had some discussions with people about functional programming and reactive programming, and it feels like NgRx and Redux are kind of built around some of those ideas. And so effects are sort of side effects, for lack of a better term, which is something that you tend to try and avoid in functional programming. Yeah, so effects would be, like you said, calling out to an external API to store data or to get data. Or another effect that I could see is updating the UI somewhere. So you update a component or load a different component. Those could all be effects. So that makes sense.
You can have multiple effects too. You don't have to have one, you have multiple. Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it interesting, the whole effect idea that we can have. I mean, it's a separate library too, so you could actually pull it in separate, right, Adrian?
Yeah, exactly. It's a different package. You have the store with everything, then you have effects and a few more.
Yeah, the one thing that I like about the idea of effects is that you can make very constrained assumptions about everything else that happens in NgRx. And then all the complicated external facing stuff, you can put into effects. And as long as you don't dump everything into effects, you can make it, so don't make them too complicated, I guess is what I'm saying. So like John said, you can have multiple effects. So update the UI could be an effect. Update this other component could be an effect. Update the server could be an effect. And essentially then you have this idea of everything else as far as just managing the state all happens in a very formalized way.
Yeah, I'm trying to treat my effects sort of like functions. They should be small and each of them should do only one thing. Yep. I don't care if I have like 40 of them for one specific entity, as long as each of them is small and I can easily understand.
Wait. You're going to have 40 effects on a single entity?
I hope not.
I want to know what you're doing.
Doing everything. So one thing that I'm curious is you said to implement the 2 payload method, and I don't. That's something that I'm not quite clear on.
Yeah, it's something that it was a part of NgRx at some point. I'm not 100% convinced that you still need it. Basically, what people are doing and what I also did on each of these actions, when you have some data to send with it, you have a payload property. And by convention, you always call it payload. And then in FX, whenever you were working with it, you had to do like action.payload. And in order to get rid of that, you're doing a map and you are mapping the data to the payload.
Gotcha.
And instead of doing that each time, it's trivial and like 10 characters to write a method to use it in the map to map it to that payload.
Mm-hmm.
And you can either do that and use it all over the place, or you can simply use like object destructuring to get the payload property and just skip the map completely.
That makes sense. So it basically comes down to how much magic you want, or, how much shorthand you want to use.
Yeah, well, if you write the same thing like 100 times, you might get bored and want to make it nicer and just remove some of the repetition.
I'm a little confused on one thing. I hope you can help me out with here. Error handling. I'm really encouraged to see that you added that as a tip inside the effects section. Like, always handle errors. Makes total sense. But let's say your effect is going off to get HTTP. It's asynchronous again, and it's not necessarily tied directly to the UI. So what do you encourage people to do in the error handler of an effect? This
is something that happened to me like 2 times or 3 times, and the first time it was really interesting. So basically, whenever we handle that effect, we work with the actions, and actions, it's all the actions in the application, and it's a stream, meaning an observable. So if you get an error on it, it's done. You won't get any kind of events after that. So what I was trying to explain there is that whenever you read data with the HTTP service or anything that involves a stream that can get an error, is to do it on another stream and just merge it into the actions with a switch to statement or any kind of similar operator, because you can handle the error there. So if you call a get and you get an error because you can't reach the service, you should do it on another stream, catch the error there and handle it. Because what happened to me, I did that exactly on the action stream. I got an error and then everything stopped. You cannot dispatch any more error. Nothing happens in your application. You're like,
that's not good. Wow.
Things grind to a halt. That's not good. Yeah. I would have to agree.
That's a great tip, because you really want to help people with that. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that, and Angular's gotten a lot better about this, but I still, in my debugging tools, get cryptic errors out of my apps, no matter what I'm using. And so if I have something that's catching the error myself and it's raising it at the right point and saying, hey, here's what happened, and it happened right here, then I can dive back in and I can get, I can eliminate everything below it, if that makes sense.
Why are you writing errors?
It's a gift. You used to work for Disney. It's a talent that I always have possessed.
Oh, geez. No, I appreciate these kinds of tips, though. I think that's what's great. Blog posts that explain, like, hey, not just the happy path, but, what do you do in the unhappy path? They're some of the best ones, in my opinion.
Well, the thing is that, even when you're writing something that's generally easy to get the happy path correct on, I don't know about you, but I have this talent for screwing it up anyway. And usually I can fix it in like 2 seconds, right? It's like, oh, duh, I did this wrong. But the idea that I might get stuck on something stupid, a typo or something, having tips like this really pays off for me.
I agree. Well, if I'm just kind of going down your list, Adrian, reducers. Actually, wait, no. You mentioned something really interesting right before that on effects. Effects are services. And I kind of skimmed over this. And you said we need to use the injectable decorator. But now that we've got and I agree with that, but now that we've got the provided in attribute that you can pass into that decorator, how do you feel about where you should provide your effects?
I haven't really thought about that. What I meant to say about the fact that they are services is that I've seen cases where people simply forget that. And they're like, okay, I have this effect, but I want to call an API or I want to call a service. How do I do that?
Yeah.
It looks like they forget that they can use dependency injection just to get any other service inside that effect class, like anything else in your application.
Right. So you're saying make sure you put the add injectable on the effect service class. So if you're injecting HTTP client, for example, it'll actually be found. And then the thing I was talking about too is the provided side is you've got to provide your services somewhere. With provided in, you can provide it at the root or you can provide it in a module, right defined inside your effects service now. Or the old way was you could do, it's not that old, but you could go into like the providers array inside of a module and define those there. I'm just curious how you roll. What do you do? Do you provide them in the ng module or do you provide them in the add injectable these days?
Most of the applications that I work on were started when we didn't have providing. So they are just spread in different modules. And now I'm updating them to use provided in. But it's like, now it's that weird state when I'm using both because it's still like old code.
Yes.
when they are in modules and new things that are being written where I'm using provided in. But this thing with provided in makes much more sense for me to use it. And it helps you because if you have a service and you don't reference it to anyone, it'll just be removed from the bundle. And that's great because I tend to forget to delete the file if it's not used. So that's helpful.
Yeah, I like that too. It's like follows the deletability of code, mantra. So if you have a service and you're not using it, you can just delete it and it's done.
I love deleting code.
Me too.
Don't have to keep that in my head anymore.
There's nothing more frustrating though when you delete code and then all of a sudden you start getting errors. You're like, it's referenced here, it's referenced there, it's referenced here, and then you end up in this like spaghetti pool. You're like, no.
It's a good way to figure out if you still need it though.
Yeah, but as Adrian was saying, if you go to provided in, then you could say, you know what, I'm not using this thing anymore, and bye bye. You just delete the file, right?
Yep, 100%.
Well, I think more and more people will use this way of registering services until I think everyone will just use provided in. They won't be specified in modules at all.
Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today.
I noticed probably the lightest section of your tips in your post is on reducers. And I'm curious of why that is, but my second part of my question there is like, you're saying keep them simple. how do you keep them simple? So first part is why no more tips on reducers? And second, like, how do you keep them simple?
Yeah, I've got this this observation from several people. Like, you have only one thing on reducers, and I was like, well, it's the most important thing. If you remember one thing from that part, I would like to be that you should keep them simple. I thought of a few others, but basically this was the biggest problem I had with reducers. So this is the only thing that I've tried to explain there. And how to keep them simple in any reducer, well, it takes care of updating the part of the state that's responsible for, and it should only update that state. So mainly what I'm doing in my reducer is just destructuring that state and overriding it with the object I get in the action, and that's it. And I've seen code like, well, if this property from the payload is true, then I need to do this, and I need to update this kind of part of the state, or maybe compute this property, and so on. And for me, that's kind of hidden logic. No one will look into reducer for it, and it's not its place to be there.
So that's a great point. So when somebody makes that kind of a code where they're putting in like if logic inside the reducer, and you're saying that's a no-no for you, where would you invite them to put it then? Like, where would they do that information?
Well, it depends on different kind of actions. For example, if I'm reading something from the API, maybe I have some kind of method that I apply to the data that I get to transform it to what I want. If it's an action from my application, we can just catch it into an effect, update whatever we want to update with the data, or maybe fetch the data from some other part or an external service, and then trigger a new effect that will get to the reducer. So not all the actions have to go to the reducer and update something in the state. Just catch them into effects, do whatever we need to them, and then update the state as needed.
You know, the biggest thing I see that makes me go, when I look at reducers is when I see code that people are running an asynchronous action inside of the reducers. Not a NgRx action, but they're running asynchronous code inside of a reducer.
Yeah, exactly.
And I see that a lot, actually.
You're talking about like HTTP calls and things like that?
Yeah, it's usually not HTTP. I mean, I have seen HTTP, like people do it inside there. It's like weird. So you go call an action, you get your state, the reducer kicks in, and sometimes they're doing HTTP there. But more often, I've seen it where it's hard to explain. Somebody will make, they have some other call locally in their app that's doing something asynchronous. I even seen like in the reducer, somebody like pops up a modal and asks somebody a question. Waiting for the answer. And I'm like, that's probably not where you want that to be. Are there any way, like what other kind of pitfalls? I sense that, through this post, you've got a lot of great experience on things that people should avoid. And I know the tip says, here's what you should do. But tell us some of the things that people can step into when they're using these.
This thing that you said, it's great. Basically, that's why I only have this thing about reducers. I've seen a lot of cases when really bad stuff was done inside reducers. And that should be really avoided. We should think about reducers maybe sort of like almost pure functions. They should just update something and that's it. And if I think it resumes down to testing. If you cannot easily test them, then maybe you're doing something weird or wrong. And
that's a good point.
You should fix it.
One thing that I'm wondering about, just not having done a ton with this particular pattern, is what does the life cycle look like? I mean, do you call a reducer from an effect or an action from an effect, or reducer from an action? Does that make sense?
Basically, the reducers are called by the library for any action that gets dispatched.
Okay.
And a reducer is just like a switch function on the action type, and if the type matches with whatever you want in the reducer, then you get the action and you can update the part of the state that you want with that data.
I think what you're getting at, Chuck, too, is, and I agree with Adrian here, that it can be confusing with all the different terms in this Redux cycle of like, you got these effects and reducers and actions and state and all this stuff. We haven't gotten into dispatching yet, but where does it start? Where does it end? I mean, like, in your component, you have to say, call this action, which we do through dispatchers generally, right? Like not call this action, but perform this action.
Uh-huh.
And then the action, let's say it's get customers. And tell me if I'm off here, Adrian. The action is get customers. The NgRx library then listens for that and then helps connect it into the reducer for you to say, look in the state for this, pull the state out, manipulate it, whatever that action says to do, and then returns that through an observable stream to whatever observable you're listening to in the component. Did I say that in a way that makes sense?
Yeah, that's what it does. It just sends it to the reducers. Basically, even if we have like 40 files with 40 different reducers, what the library does, it combines all of them into one huge reducer. So basically, each action is sent to all of the reducers, and it just switches on the type, and whatever it matches, it updates the state. And you use selectors in your components to get data from the state, and that selector is creating an observable. So each time that property from the state changes, you get a new value on the stream that something changed, and you update your UI, or you react to it in any way you want.
So you don't ever really manipulate the reducer in any way. You never talk to the reducer directly, is kind of my point.
Right.
Yep.
So the other bit that I'm wondering about then is, let's say that I say get customers and I haven't preloaded a customer list into my state. Is that something that I should have done before now? Or does that happen somewhere in the life cycle where it calls our effects, and the effects load the information into the state, and then the reducer pulls it back out for the action?
Now, this is a widely used pattern, I think, to load data like this. So when you want to load the customers, you would actually trigger an action, for example, called fetch customers. This will be handled only by an effect.
Oh, I gotcha. So the action will call the effect.
The effect, basically that action is sent to an observable, to a stream, and the effect listens to that stream, and whenever it catches that action that you care about, it lets you do something. And in our case, we'll do, for example, an HTTP call to get the customers. And when we get all the data back, we trigger a new action, for example, customers fetch success, with the payload of all the customers that were loaded. That goes into a reducer, and the reducer will update the state with the new list of customers. And your selector in a component will get the new value with the customers, and your UI will get updated with the new list of customers. This would be like the life cycle, and this is like a normal thing where you use effects for.
Okay, that makes sense. I just wasn't sure what the workflow looked like there.
I think a lot of it depends on what you want to do too, Chuck. Like you could theoretically, just as he said, have an effect that goes off and gets the data when you want. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll say get customers. I'll say, here's a selector for the customers. And I'll have an action there that basically says, fetch customers or whatever. The reducer looks in the state tree first to see, okay, pull out the state. The selector says, give me back the customers. Initially, that's an empty array.
Right.
There's a moment in time where your component, your view, has no customers, and it was told by the store there's nothing there.
Yep.
But in the meantime, there's an asynchronous event happening, the effect, which is also listening to the action, saying, okay, I'm going to go get that stuff. And then it's going to run through the reducer, the state tree, and selector back again. So there's actually, that depends how you want it. That lets you have like empty and then full.
Right.
If you want to check it yourself, you can check it yourself and then go call HTTP. It really depends how you want to play the game.
Right. That makes sense. So in your scenario, it gives me back an empty array, triggers an effect to go get the customers from the back end. And then when that comes back, then it uses the reducer to put it in, update the state. And then there's another effect that goes and updates my UI.
Not an effect, but the selector. It's the same selector. So through the same selector, everything is right to the end there. The selector you're listening to in the component effectively comes back the first time with your empty array and the second time with your full array.
Okay.
And it's not happening synchronously, remember. So when you call your action, two things kind of split off. They fork at that point. The first point is the action goes to the reducer, goes to the state tree, gets the empty array, pulls it back. So simultaneously, the action says, or the effect says, hey, I want that action too. And I'm going to go make an HTTP call. And let's say it takes a second and a half. When it's done, it runs through that same cycle again.
Right.
So it's a little magical, to be honest with you. I think this whole cycle is a little weird. It's hard to grok. And honestly, I usually have to look at a diagram to kind of remind myself of what's happening. I just know that, like, for me as a component writer, I say, here's my selector and, where's my data? Bring it back in.
Right. And that's something that's in here. It says under general, it says use selectors. So selector is essentially, I'm interested in this state or this state change or this kind of action. Am I thinking of this properly? And then it can come back around because it knows that selector is something that correlates with what I'm doing.
Basically you have a select method, then you just specify I want this slice of the state or this property, and you get back an observable that will emit a value each time that property, the state changes.
So whenever that changes, then I have an observable that says, hey, and it pushes up.
Exactly. So you don't need to do anything after that. And
your state usually ends up pretty big, so people will create selectors on pieces of the state that they can listen to. Yeah.
Yeah, but it comes through an observable, so whenever it changes, I just get a new set of state.
Exactly.
Which is just that little piece of the overall store.
Yeah,
Here, update to this.
Anything you want, a property, a list, whatever you need from the state.
Yep.
And my tip there was about these selectors, like when you create that observable, you can just specify, okay, I want to go to state and get customers and get the list of customers and so on. Or you can use a method from NgRx, it's called create selector, to simply create a function that knows how to get this part of the state. So instead of just putting that it's either a string or you get the state and go to where you need to go, just add this selector function. You usually create separate files with them, and if you have them like this, you have several benefits. For example, when you're starting out with this, you'll keep moving objects around in your state because you know for sure where they should belong. And if you're using this kind of selector functions, then you just change your selector and that's it. For example, you have get username. You don't need to know throughout your application what exactly that's in the state. You just know that you want the username.
Right.
And then you can move the user to some other place in your state, change that one selector and everything will work. You don't have to update anything else.
Right. So I can hand my selector off to multiple places.
Exactly. So if you just write, I want to select and get username, and that's it. You don't need to know anything else.
Huh.
And this allows you to compose selectors. So just fetch different parts of the different slices of the state and then just combine them together as needed. And another benefit here is that they use internally a technique that I think it's called memoization or something like that, which basically says that each time these selectors are pure functions. So if you call them with the same arguments, it won't call the function again. It will just remember your previous value and return it to you. So if you have 3 values from the state and call it and then call it again, it won't call that method and just return the value back to you. In case you're doing, I don't know, some kind of expensive computation or something there.
Hopefully you're not doing, but yes.
Exactly, I know. That was what I was thinking. What the heck could I do there to be that expensive? But
I think, seeing a trend in some of your tips here too, and a lot of it is, not only avoiding pitfalls, but also easier ways to code. For example, I saw you're taking advantage of the action creator technique. You're also in this case saying you should take advantage of the create selector technique. There's a lot of terms in NgRx, the Redux model. So when you've got these actions, reducers, effects, and dispatchers, and I'm probably missing 2 or 3 others that I forgot already, states and stores, it's nice to have a way to kind of to make the code easier. And I agree, the create selectors is a nice tip.
Yep.
It's a lot of terminology, and usually it takes quite a bit of time for someone new to grasp everything and understand what's going on.
And you're
saying I get most of it now, but I'll have forgotten it by tomorrow. So,
and Adrian says, "Don't use the store all over the place." What do you mean?
Isn't that the point, right? I've got this store. I need all the data everywhere.
Clickbait. Is this clickbait, man? Don't use the store. Create a store and then don't use it. No, I'm sure you're getting us something more important. So tell us about that.
Just in one place. Yeah, well, I think this is more like so-called dumb components. Basically, I've seen people that, okay, I have the store, I need this data, so I'm just going to fetch it wherever I need it.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of sometimes creates some problems. Usually when I design a new feature or some new components, I try to make most of them dumb. So they are basically just simple components that have some HTML. They know how to display it. And they have some inputs and outputs. And that's it. They don't know about anything else. They don't know about any service. They don't know about any store and anything. And somewhere an upper level is like a parent. I have something called the container or main page, or can call it different names. And that's where I know the store and create the selectors, and I fetch the data, trigger new actions, and so on. And inside this container, I have all the dumb components that don't know anything about any store. They basically don't know anything about the application. They don't just know, okay, I get a list of customers, I have to show it. And when the user clicks on a customer, I emit the event that customer clicked, and so on. And the container is the one that knows about the store, triggers the actions, selects all the data, and so on.
That makes sense.
Then all those components are sort of like easier to test and to reason about because they are, well, very simple.
Right. Like it's just a button. It doesn't, the component's job is to know to dispatch an action.
Exactly. So you click the button and it just triggers and output a normal Angular output and event that the button was clicked. And a container somewhere above will trigger an action. And maybe, for example, we're going to reuse that component, and in different places it will trigger different actions. And that's easy to do because we don't have any kind of action hard-coded inside it.
That makes sense. Are there any types of data that you may not want to use inside your NgRx store? I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe login information or, just basic global user information that it might be overkill to use NgRx on?
Well, it depends. I'm not holding any kind of logging information there. Actually, when I initially started, I started without NgRx because I said I didn't need anything like that. And I've soon figured out that was a mistake. And then I've added more and more data. And right now, for example, I'm storing even the router data in the state, because sometimes in some selectors, it's helpful to know that you're on a specific page and you got there with that specific customer ID and so on. And I think I'm storing most of the data there. For example, even form data, a user just enters something and before you submit it to the server, I just store it in the state and so on. There might be some things that I don't know.
I want to ask you why on something. I like to ask why, by the way. So
yeah,
I'm reading here, property initialization. You're saying that don't do it in the constructor. Instead, do it, from your example, right where the property is defined.
Yeah.
You don't say why. So
I think the only reason for me there is that it's less code. And it's easier to reason about. Like you guys said, if I can have less code, I would love to have it. So it's, I think I find it cleaner probably just because it's, like I said, not that much code. And some people think that, okay, now I have to define my property and then I have to initialize it in the constructor on ng on init or somewhere and just place it there. It works. It looks okay.
Because I noticed your example, you've got company name and document status, and they're both defined as properties. And then in the constructor, you've got to repeat those again and then set them to the selector. So yeah, I can definitely see that's less code.
And you have to define the type if you create it as property, while if you just initialize directly, typically would infer the type and you don't have to put that there.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's not in here that I've gone back and forth on, and I'm curious to get your take on, is this. Looking at your property initialization. So getting back to like Chuck, you had a question. I'm in a component. I want to get some data. What do I do, right? You use a selector to get that. But to use a selector inside your component, you, like looking at your code here, Adrian, you would say this.store.select and then whatever you're selecting, right?
Yeah.
The store object itself is a reference to the NgRx store. So that means you have to inject the store into your component, right?
Yep.
One of the things, to me, I like separation. So I want my app to not even know NgRx is involved, my component, for example. So one of the things I was starting to do, and I don't know, I felt both ways in this. I was creating this Angular service, just another class, which effectively helps dole out all of my selectors. So that way, I don't actually have to inject the store into 500 components. Instead, I inject this, it's an abstraction, this abstraction service that basically handles giving me my selectors to it. And the upside to that is, you're not really putting all the store stuff inside your component. The downside is there's yet another thing you have to deal with. I'm curious, have you done this before? Am I crazy? What do you think?
I've seen this pattern, and I'm actually investigating it. I haven't used it yet, like in a production application. I just played with it. For me, it makes sense, because what I did to reduce this usage of store was, like I previously just create some containers, and just those containers know about the store. But this would be even a step further, like just isolate everything, keep it in that service, and then whenever I need it, even if it's just in the container, I just get something from the service. And then, like you say, it's perfect because no one knows anything about that store. But exactly like you said, it's another level of indirection or added, because you have to get the data from the service and have to trigger actions from the service. But I think you have some benefits with that way of doing things also.
Yeah, honestly, in the end, 6 of one, half dozen the other is how I felt. But the one thing that still sticks out to me is, let's say it's company name. That's what you're grabbing. Your code here says company name is your observable equals this.store.select my detail selector.get document company name. The abstraction, if you had the abstraction place, you could simply say company name equals this dot, whatever you call this abstraction, this dot my service dot company name. So to me, the code in your component becomes simpler to read. So you don't have to use, because I find the selector syntax to be a little more lengthy to read. So that's the one thing I keep going back to with this. And I haven't kind of firmed up which way I like yet. But since you're putting out tips here, I thought I might ask you.
Yeah, that's good. And I think it's even better because someone might create components or work with them, and they might even not know what the heck NgRx is and what's doing there. You have a service and you have some methods in those services and just use them.
Yeah, it's just an observable. That's really what it becomes. It becomes this service class that says, here's my observable.
Yeah.
You don't really know that it came from NgRx or it came from Chuck's garage,
You don't want to see my garage.
Well, I think right now in some Angular applications that I've seen, services are underrated. So in most cases, there are just some HTTP calls inside them or maybe some data. But like you suggested, I think we can use them for much more than that for sure.
Cool. Thank you for sharing all these tips with us.
Thank you. It's what I've learned, what I've hit around when I work with it. And it was nice for me to write in there. And it's also helpful because from time to time I forget, and then I go back to my article and see what I said I should do. It's like a reminder for myself.
So what are you working on now? Or what are you working on next?
I'm trying to finish a new blog post where I try to explain how you can create a toast service with Angular CDK and those kind of notifications that show up, like snack bar, I think they are called in Angular material.
Cool.
Hopefully it will be published on Angular in depth in the next day or something.
We'll keep an eye out for it.
Great.
If people want to find you online, where do they generally go? Are you mostly posting to Angular in depth, or do you have other places to post?
I usually post on Medium. I'm probably on Angular in depth, and everyone can find me on Twitter. I'm just Adrian Faciu. Basically, if you search for my name, you will find me because I think I have the same handler all over the places.
Very cool. All right. Well, anything else we should dive into, John, or should we get to picks?
Well, the elephant in the room is darn well that I want to talk about NgRx data, but we should do a whole show on that topic.
We definitely should. Yeah, we'll get that scheduled. Yeah, there's a lot to talk to here, and it's funny because I occasionally will talk to people and they'll want a show on like NgRx or Angular CLI or something like that, and we kind of scratched the surface of it. And this was nice because we went into a little more depth, I think, than we've been able to in the past with NgRx. And yeah, I'm kind of looking for some of those deeper ideas. So if you're interested, I am actually working on, I was using another system for ideas for show topics. And I just switched it over, and basically I have forms on devchat.tv that you can fill in, and then you can go vote stuff up on Trello. So listeners can go check that out. I'll make sure that I get links to all that in the show notes. But yeah, if there's anything that people in specific want to know about NgRx, I mean, even if it's a, hey, how the heck do I do this thing or that thing on NgRx or Angular, or I have a component that I think that does this, that I think should do this other thing. I'd love to have some of those discussions too, so we can get a little deeper on some of these topics. So anyway, I'm just going to throw that out there. And with that, let's go ahead and do some picks. And yeah, we'll make sure that we get that scheduled, John.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Do you have some picks for us, John?
Well, surprise, surprise, I'm going to pick NgRx data. As a Ward, Bell, and I put this thing together. He's really the brains behind it. And I'm kind of the usability side and testing it out. And it's going really, really well. It's going to be pulled into the main NgRx library. We actually just met with Mike Ryan and Brandon Roberts and Rob Wormwald a couple weeks ago at Angular Mix. And we were talking about the plans to do that. There's just a lot going on right now with the Angular community, trying to get new versions of Angular up there. And the other thing is getting the new build system in play. They're trying to use Bazel with it. So anyway, once things die down with that, NgRx data will get out of my repo, which you can currently find it in johnpapa/NgRx-data in GitHub. And it'll go over to the main NgRx library. I've had a lot of excited people using it. And the big key right now is we want to just get it out of my repo and into the official repo so the whole team can support it. So check it out. I won't tell you exactly what it does because we're going to do an entire show on it. But I think it's pretty darn cool. And it's not a competitor for NgRx. It is part of NgRx. So definitely check that out. The next thing I'd like to do as a tip is conferences. There's too many conferences around here. So my biggest tip for everybody is don't feel FOMO for not going to all these conferences that are out there. There are probably 1,000 of them these days. And it's very easy to feel like you're missing out on something if you don't make them all. Best thing you can do is, just know that a lot of the stuff's online through videos. You can check it out with slides and things. And if you miss one, there's always another one, next week or probably the next day. So don't worry about the FOMO of missing events and conferences. Nobody goes to all of them. And God bless the ones who go to, a couple dozen a year, like Chuck.
Yeah, I don't go to all of them by any means.
No.
This year for Angular, I made it to NGConf because it's right here in Salt Lake. Framework Summit, also right here in Salt Lake. I was at Microsoft Ignite and met John there in person for a few minutes. I've been to a couple of podcasting conferences. That's about it. It's funny because people get this idea that, a lot of us travel to a lot of conferences, and some folks do. But generally, they're speaking at a lot of them, and they have some reason for wanting to do that. Whether it's just they feel like it's their chance to connect with the community and they have some kind of evangelism job, or whether, they just really, really enjoy the travel, which is part of why I do it. Or it's just, there are a lot of reasons for it. But yeah, the vast majority of folks make it to maybe a conference or two a year. and it's generally in different aspects of their job. Most people aren't making it to all the Angular conferences unless they're on the Angular core team. So yeah, I agree with that. And the other thing is that if you feel like you have to be at all the conferences just to keep up, all the talks wind up on YouTube anyway. And so you can keep up that way. The thing that I get most out of conferences is just meeting people. I'm going to jump in with a couple of picks. So I've been playing with Discord, which is, how do you describe it? Something between Slack and Skype, I guess, because it runs under its own app. It's not web-based like Slack is. But I am really, really liking it a lot more than I liked Slack. So I'm going to pick Discord. I'm probably going to set up a devchat.tv Discord channel team, whatever. So keep an eye out for that. And also that system for recommending stuff, recommending topics. Adrian, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, just two of them I think are enough. First one would be the Angular in-depth blog. I've learned a lot from it. And well, now since I'm also posting blogs there from time to time, I really recommend it to anyone that wants to read interesting things about Angular. That would be my first one. And my second pick is a tool that made my life way easier and nicer. It's called Wallaby. It's a continuous testing tool for JavaScript applications. I use it almost daily writing tests. I'm not involved with the guys that made it in any way, but for me it was like, no, I like writing tests even much more than before. It's way nicer to do it like this. Yeah,
I've heard good things about them, so I'll have to check them out.
Yeah, all right, well, my picks.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming, Adrian.
Thanks a lot for the invite, and it's been a pleasure.
All right, well, we'll wrap this up, and we'll catch everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.